Welcome to the Bone Anatomy Lab. This is Dr. Walla, and I will be showing you around the bones. This is a long bone. I'm going to label the two ends of the long bone the epiphysis. Now, singular is epiphysis, plural is epiphyses. I'm going to go with epiphysis. And in the middle, we call this thing the shaft of the bone. We call it the diaphysis. Now, I took this label from the internet, so there are a few extra lines on here. What I want to focus in on right now is that there are structures called growth plates, which are actually called epiphyseal plates. And I'm drawing them in right here on the end of the bone. Now, when the bone, there's also the same plates are at this end, right? As the bone grows, these plates extend out, pushing the cartilage-coated ends of the bone out. So these things are going to be called epiphyseal plates. And so I'm going to label those as the epiphyseal plate. And I'm just going to do it singular because I'm only on one side. Okay? Now let's take a look at part of the bone that's here in the middle. And I'm going to label down there a type of bone that is the type of the bone that is the strong part of the bone. And that is going to be called compact bone. And that is the bone that makes up this part of the diaphysis. All right. However, on the inside of that diaphysis, there's some other material, and we're going to call that material yellow bone marrow. So it's going to be labeled here. Oop, there's the cavity there. So I think if I've got that right from this image, I'll just draw my own line in there. Yellow bone marrow is found in the hollow part of the bone. And yellow bone marrow is going to have things like fat storage. So if an organism were starving to death, it might use the fat in the yellow bone marrow as a last resort. Okay, then let's take a look at the ends. We have a section of bone up here that is called spongy bone. And the spongy bone actually looks kind of spongy in that area. It kind of has a cross-hatched matrix-like look to it. Inside of that spongy bone is a structure that is called red bone marrow. And so you can't really see the marrow because it's like a series of cells that are spread around out inside this area. And you can sort of see those things in here. But that red bone marrow actually is the site for blood cell production. Blood cell production. Both red cells, which carry oxygen, of course, and it's also the site for white blood cells, which are the immune system. These things make up the immune system. So when we talk about B cells and T cells that protect your body against infection, that's where it comes from. So there are a whole lot of different types of cells that form that part. Now, in short, this area is going to have what we would call adult stem cells. And stem cells are cells that have not yet differentiated in their pathway completely, or if they have reached the end of their differentiation. So, for example, when an organism begins as a we take the egg and the sperm and add them together, and that equals this cell called the zygote. The zygote then divides to 2, and then it divides to 4, and then it divides to lots of cells to make an individual. All these would be considered stem cells, but they're not adult cells yet because they're embryonic. But later on in the body, there will be a little over 200 kinds of tissues. And each of those tissues has an adult stem cell that divides to make that tissue. So, for example, you have some stem cells at the bottom of your skin. So your skin's constantly being reproduced. All right? And in your immune system, what you have are these adult stem cells, I'll just label it an AST, which can divide to become red blood cells. And they can also divide to become white blood cells. So these are all in your red bone marrow, right? And then these white blood cells go on to become the many different types of immune system cells. So in people that have, for example, immune system difficulties like leukemia, for example, is a disease that is a bone cancer. Leukemia can destroy the immune system. And also, if you're looking at severe chemotherapy that people take, because it attacks rapidly dividing cells, actually you might use what's called a bone marrow transplant. And a bone marrow transplant would actually to take either your own bone marrow or from somebody closely related and take it out, do the treatment, and then re-inject that bone marrow later to provide that person with an actively dividing cell line that would make their immune system. So those are really important cells, and they are all in the red bone marrow, which is housed in the spongy bone area. Oh, that feels good. I think that's long bone biology. Let's take a look down here how this long bone is made up of. So this is going to be an image here of what we call compact bone. And the compact bone has this structure in it. I'll use a red marker here, I guess, to look. This structure right here, you can see that there are many of them. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here. They're basically all stacked up like these long tubes. And this one is pulled up and out so we can look at it. And that structure right there is called an osteon. And this is the fundamental unit of bone growth. All right, let's take a look at what an osteon would look like up close. And you can tell from this image, this is just one of these little circles, right? It makes this giant picture down here. When we label this, we have a couple of different things to look at. In the inside, here are blood vessels. And those blood vessels are referred to, they're actually carried in what we call the Haversian canal. It's an unusual spelling. It has two A's in it. But that canal takes capillary blood supplies to these small units of bone called the osteons, right? So, well, I guess I should write osteon really big on here because that's what this is. This is an osteon. Again, the fundamental osteon, the fundamental unit of bone growth. And then you'll see moving out from that osteon through this sort of bone layers. This thing is rolled up like, I like to describe it as a Swiss roll, what we used to call Hostess. Not the cupcakes. Ding dongs. There were ding dongs, and there were the Swiss rolls that had a name. Oh, now I'm going to forget them. Anyway, let's take a look at what we'll label that circulatory pattern. And that pattern is blood moving out from the inside via these small canals. And those canals are called Canaliculi, which is the Italian for little canals. And those are these little red, these things here. You can see these little patterns, these little curves. These are actually pores through the bone that carry small capillaries to these little spaces out there. And the little spaces are going to be called lacunae. Now, lacunae is plural for the word that I'm looking for, but I'm going to go ahead and use it all the time as lacunae anyway. And the lacunae, let's see how that looks. I'm going to say that doesn't look very good, so let's bring it up a little bit higher. The lacunae is just a space where we find an osteocyte on the inside. So I'm just going to draw a line from here to the lacunae. And the lacunae are like this space. It could also be this space. It's just a space in the bone. But what's in that space is more important, is called an osteocyte. I'm actually going to put the osteocyte on this side over here. And let's label there's inside those cells, inside those lacunae spaces are little cells. And those cells are called osteocytes. Okay? Those are bone maintenance cells. Nice. So the osteon then has been nicely visualized here by these pictures. That helps a lot. I should notice that it is built in these layers like this. So I called it a Swiss roll, but these layers are called lamellae. I don't usually put that on an exam, but it's nice to know that they are called lamellae, which makes them layer-like structures. If you cut this across and then you dye it with India ink, you can see that the little pockets in there collect the ink, and you can see more clearly those structures. And so one way to do this, you can quickly see that this in the middle is what? Yes, that's the Haversian canal, right? And then if I look at one of these things, what I'm seeing is a lacunae. And inside that very thing, right, is a cell that I'm going to call an osteocyte. So if I ask you what cell is in there, you would say osteocyte. If I ask you what the structure is, it's a lacunae. And then you can see all these little lines growing out here between them, and those are the Canaliculi. Oops, my handwriting is not so great today. Let's get that fixed up. Canaliculi. You might back out a little bit, and then you could see the same structures here. This page, like there's an osteon, there's an osteon, there's an osteon, there's an osteon. So this would be a whole bunch of osteons forming the bone structure. And again, the black dot in the middle would be the Haversian canal. So when we look at cartilage, that's the next image that we have here. This is the cartilage picture. This tissue is a little different than the bone. It also has lacunae, and in this case, the lacunae are these spaces that hold inside. They hold a cell, which is called a chondrocyte. And so the actual chondrocyte cell is inside the lacunae. So I'm going to try to bring my label over this way, and then I'm going to tie it back by pointing in directly into the cell. So that essentially means that if I draw that out, it looks like I have this tissue, and I have these lacunae in it. And inside the lacunae is a little red triangle. We use triangles to represent chondrocyte cells. So those would be these cells on the inside, and that is a cartilage maintenance cell. So that is a cartilage maintenance cell. The rest of that material in there just becomes labeled what is called the collagen matrix, right? Which is all the space that is just in between those cells. This is all relevant, right? Because when a bone is broken, it heals relatively quickly because it has good circulation, referring back here to the Haversian canal and the Canaliculi. However, that drives straight to the cells. However, in the cartilage, there is not a lot of circulatory system. You don't see Haversian canal, you don't see Canaliculi, you don't have any way to move blood directly to chondrocytes. As a result, they have to heal and get their nutrients only through diffusion. So they heal much more slowly than does actual bone tissue. So that is what it's like to compare bone repair to cartilage repair. It has to do with there's much more circulation in bones, so it heals more quickly. Osteoporosis is a disease that occurs. There are two types of bone cells. I'm not listing them where they occur exactly, but there are two categories. One is an osteoblast, which is this starts with has a B in it, which build bone, and the other is an osteoclast, which I say carves bone away, but basically it removes bone. So it's easy to remember if you use the C for carve and the B for build, right? And when you carve away more bone than you build, then your bones become weak, and that's exactly what happens in the condition of osteoporosis. There are a couple of ways of preventing that. One is by stress on the bones, and I don't mean nervous stress. Stress on bones causes growth, and so they grow and respond to pressure. So if you want to increase the mass of your bones by activating the osteoblasts, then you do things like weightlifting. Weightlifting, for example, increases the stress on the bones, which will increase their mass. The popular citation here is that astronauts have to do special exercises in space because since they're weightless, their bones don't grow in response and their bones can become very weak. Another alternative is to make sure that one gets enough calcium. Calcium is required for the ossification of bones. And bones also store calcium for use by the body. Calcium is one, the other is vitamin D. Both of these are required. This is produced by the skin in sunlight. And so when people live in areas that are very far north, like north of the Arctic Circle, and don't get enough light for 6 months of the year because it's very dark, they can get what is called Osteomalacia, which basically means their bones become soft and the bones in the legs will actually bend so that your long bone, instead of being this nice, healthy, long, straight long bone with your hip sitting on it, becomes a long bone that becomes actually bent and curved like this to the other end, so that there's the bow-legged structure occurs. The legs become bowed to the outside because of their soft bones. Due to a lack of either vitamin D or calcium can cause that. In children, they call it Rickets. It's the same disease. It's named differently in children. We also notice that in development, bones, now what I mean by development is as you grow up, beginning in utero, bones begin as cartilage, right? Cartilage, and then they go to being bone. And in that process, so young people, young people that are like, in the ages of from birth to probably about 13 years old, have soft bones. And so their bones often, instead of breaking by snapping, they bend, and you can get what's called a green stick fracture. And it's a lot like trying to bend a green stick of willow that's not brittle, and so the fractures can be very painful, but the bone doesn't actually break, it just bends. So I think we've covered the major points of the bone here. We even dabbled a little bit in stem cells, but look back through these images and you should be able to recognize all the different things labeled in this lecture when presented to you in a photo. And you should be able to describe the diseases we talked about and the function of some of these different cells. And you should also be able to label the anatomy of the long bone. So awesome. Next step, go out and memorize some bones and other things.